Well, good morning to you all. I am Christian Smith of the Department of Sociology at University of Notre Dame, formerly of UNC Chapel Hill for some years, and welcome to my workshop session. I want to get started by telling you very briefly what I'm planning on covering here. So if it's different than what you thought you were coming to, you'll be able to go to a workshop session that'll scratch your itch better than mine will. So I will take no offense if you just get up and walk out. Everyone should make the most of their options while you're here. So the general title that I've been giving is something like, To Whom Are We Preaching? And what I'm going to focus on specifically, because it's what my research is about, is young people, especially what we call emerging adults, which academics think of as 18 to 29-year-olds. So that's what I'm going to, the answer to whom are we preaching is lots and lots of different kinds of people. So there's no one way to, other than to just say that, have fun because you have about 25 different audiences you're trying to speak to simultaneously. So what I'm going to do is, besides making that point about diversity, is here to focus on one of those particular audiences and break it down into subversions of that audience, 18 to 23-year-olds. And I'm going to set them in the context of the kind of religion that most of them sort of absorbed or adopted or invented when they were teenagers. So teenagers into 20-year-olds. And I'm going to talk for a little bit about where this idea of emerging adulthood comes from, sort of generally what most of them tend to assume about religion and spirituality and church and so on, sort of the cultural models that they're operating with. I'm going to talk about some different types of emerging adults that we've found out there in the culture, and then try to say more specifically where many Catholics tend to fit in that typology. And then I'm going to circle back to the general background of sort of the religious worldviews of many young people, that these emerging adults, what they would have picked up earlier in life, what religion and church and faith are all about in the first place. If you are super familiar with my research and my books, this is just going to be repetition for you, so you may go somewhere else. If you're not familiar, you may find something valuable and interesting here. So again, feel free to get up, go in and out, whatever works for you. I don't take offense. And meanwhile, so everything I say comes out of a project called the National Study of Youth and Religion that I have been conducting. I started in 1999, actually. And I've published a number of books out of that, which, for your information, I'm just going to give out to you, and you can circulate and look at and pass on, just to give you a sense of the actual concrete publications. I noticed they weren't out there, but the concrete publications that I'm sort of speaking out of. Very briefly, I'm not going to do my whole PowerPoint song and dance. I'm just going to quickly summarize. You can go back and learn more if you want about the project, but very briefly, in the early 2000s, we got a nationally representative sample of more than 3,000 teenagers, 13 to 17, and conducted a very long survey with the teenager and their parent, and one of their parents, and then we followed them, the same people, as they grew up. We tracked where they lived, where they moved to, what was going on in their lives, and we conducted 4 waves of data collection. Every time we conducted a long survey with them, and then we followed up with in-depth interviews around the country. The first wave in 2003, we did 300 and some odd in-depth interviews with teenagers in 45 states around the country, in great depth, learning about their lives and so on. And then 2 years later, we did another one. 3 years later, we did another one. 5 years later, we did another one, survey and interviews. So we have a very in-depth, complex, rich picture of a cohort of young people who've been developmentally coming of age from as young as 13 to our last survey as old as 29 years old. So it's really sort of watching kids grow up, basically, and talking to them in great depth about what they assume, what they believe, what they experience, etc., with regard to religion, spirituality, church, faith, practice, and everything else in their lives. So from that project, I've been involved in publishing a lot of books. One goes all the way back to the teenage years, called Soul Searching, and the latest is called Young Catholic America, Emerging Adults in, Out of, and Gone from the Church. So this one is focused specifically on Catholics. So I'm just going to sort of start here and let these sort of be passed around while I talk. So, I also have handouts. Rather than doing a PowerPoint and you having to remember or scribble down, I just decided to do a handout of the most basic slides. Thank you very much. I hope there are enough of these. No, I did 50, so hopefully that's enough slides for you to work with. So if you get the handout and look at the top right-hand slide that says Context, the Rise of Emerging Adulthood. This is just to get a sense of, so emerging adulthood is a term that was coined by a psychologist at Clark University named Jeffrey Arnett. And since then, a whole minor industry in the study of young people has emerged, studying emerging adults. As I said, emerging adults are normally thought of as, or defined as age 18 to 29. 18 marks the official in our culture age at which somebody is done with high school, either ready to get a job if they can find one or go to college. Historically, it's sort of a coming of age. You're not a minor anymore. You're less underneath the tutelage of one's parents and so on. Of course, in real life, some people do this well before 18, and other people do it well after 18. But from an academic point of view, this is sort of like the official marker. And the idea of emerging adulthood is it's the time that has come to be a long time in American life course between leaving home, being a teenager, being in high school, on the one hand, and being a real adult, settled down, one's own adult in real life at the other end of this. Emerging adulthood is going from that, the beginning of that, to the end of that. Now, what does it mean to be a real adult? This is not my definition. When scholars ask Americans, what does it mean to be an adult in this society? Most Americans agree that it's defined by the following things. You have a real job that's your job. It's not just a stepping stone. It's not just a trying something. It's basically going to be sort of the job you're going to work for a long time. You have a place where you live that's actually your place. It's not your friend's couch. It's not your parents' basement. Maybe you may own, you may rent, but it's basically your place. You are, or the person who's an adult has engaged in family formation, namely they've partnered with somebody, they've married somebody, they have somebody that's going to be their sort of life partner, there's who they're going to build a family with. And not always, but for very many Americans, they think also being a real adult is moving toward or having children. So the archetypal real adult in an American's mind is you're married, you have children, you have a job, and you have a place to live. All right, so emerging adulthood is the time between saying goodbye to mom and dad in high school and being a real adult. And the idea of emerging adulthood is that in the last many decades, that period of time has become really stretched out as a long time. So the concept here is comparison to the mid-20th century when, archetypally, somebody would have graduated high school, married in a very short time, with the rules being quite clear about how it works. Graduated high school, marry your high school sweetheart, get a job in the factory or office, that job existed, and work there pretty much most of your life and pay off a 30-year mortgage and have kids when you're in your 20s. That would have been sort of the archetypal mid-20th century, very short emerging adult experience. It wasn't even a long experience, so it didn't have a name. It was just thought of transition to adulthood. That's what it had been called. And it would have been characterized by pretty quick for most people, the rules pretty clear, everyone sort of knew how it was done, and very many people, not everyone did it, but very many people did do it. It was sort of normative. So in contrast to that, a whole set of things have taken that transition to adulthood and stretched it out to 10 years long, 8 years long, 12 years long. A very long and very important chunk of people's lives is now in this sort of limbo land of, I'm not a kid anymore and I'm not an adult. That's what we mean by emerging adulthood conceptually. Now, and that's characterized, in contrast to what I just said, is it's not just a long period of time. It's like getting through the Gobi Desert from one end to the other. It's the rules of how it is to be negotiated have become much less clear. The nature of relationships, how one does this, the ability to hit the reset button and go back and try to start over again. It's all much more murky. And so on the positive side, that means young people have a lot more freedom, a lot more openness, some ability, especially if they come from the right social class, to fail and to pick up and try something again. There's a lot of options. On the negative side, the dark side of that is there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of feeling in limbo, there can be like all sorts of experimentation that turns out to be disappointing or grievous, and so it's a sort of an upheaval, it's a not settled. So the quickest way to describe what an emerging adult is not yet settled. Now, that has consequences for the Catholic Church, because traditionally, all American religions, and especially, I would say, American Catholicism, has this sense of, well, you commit to something, you invest in something, you profess something, and you try to work out your baptismal confession in a way of life. You become part of a community. You have certain obligations. You get invested in things, right? To be a good religious person in America generally, and to be a good Catholic historically in America specifically, has meant some version of settle down, get involved, get consistent, and start maturing somewhere in one's faith, right? Something like that. The whole notion of emerging adulthood is, ooh, that'll happen sometime in the future. Right now, I'm not settled. I'm keeping options open. I'm exploring things. I don't want to be locked in. That's the underlying mentality. I want to be able to shift jobs or locations if I need, or romantic partners if I need to. And so there's a fundamental disjunct between the very structure and culture of emerging adulthood per se at this crucial time in young people's people's lives, and what at least they think of, and I think the church thinks of, is sort of the character of a faithful Christian life. There's this disconnect. Now, very briefly, where did emerging adulthood come from? How come we have emerging adulthood where people still in their young 30s don't exactly know who they are and what they're going to do and where they're living and who they like, et cetera? It's a combination of things. The expansion of higher education in the latter 20th century means lots of people are in school for a lot longer. You don't just graduate high school and have a life career. You go to college, maybe you go to grad school. A lot of people are in school a lot longer, and school, by its definition, is not really an adult settled down yet. Delayed age of first marriage and childbirth. People used to, in the mid-20th century, people had babies a lot younger than they do now. People wait a lot longer to have a baby, and if you've had a child or know people that have a child, there's nothing like having a child to sort of say, okay, the party's over, it's time to grow up. And so to push that off, not that kids aren't parties in their own way, but to push that off is to say, hey, the party's still going. It's 4 a.m, turn the music up, sort of thing. So delayed age of first marriage and childbirth has helped to extend this period of time. Macroeconomic changes requiring flexibility and mobility. We know you don't just graduate high school and get a nice, at least decent job in the office or the factory for the rest of your life. It's not like that. Technology's changing, everything's changing, globalization, and young people know that. And so they're sort of keeping all their options open, trying to learn, trying to try new things, and that has this overall effect of don't get locked into anything, basically. Sustained parental support well into the 20s. Very many parents do not want their kids to fail, and so increasingly, whereas in my father's generation it was for him at 16, okay, you're on your own now, grow up and make a life for yourself. Now it's sort of like, well, we know you're 29, but we really want to help can we give you a loan? At least parents that can afford this. But there's a sense of ongoing support, which another way to put that is this parental subsidizing of not being ready to settle down yet, because to maximize future economic possibilities. The development of the pill in the 60s and other accessible contraceptives, so people had much more control over when they were and weren't going to have children. cultural saturation of mass consumer entertainment, this general sense, most of the images and messages coming at all of us, and especially young people, are you're here, the kind of animal you are is one who's fundamentally oriented to having your desires and felt needs satiated by products. So spend money, earn money, and spend money to fulfill yourself in that way. So to be entertained. And that feeds into this emerging adult kind of lifestyle and culture. And finally, the influence of postmodern relativism and skepticism. I won't go on and on about this, but basically not high French theory postmodernism, but sort of a vulgarized sense of you can't trust authorities. All powers are essentially evil. Authorial intent. You have no idea what an author really meant. It's how audiences receive it. It's what it means to you. Identities are not these sort of things you form across your lives. They're fluid and fragmented and reconstructed all the time. All of these themes from the broader postmodern movement intellectually have come down to young people, and all of us actually make it sort of everything's open, everything's interpreted, everything's up to you. All of this came together and has formed this culture of what people do, what they enter into on the one end of the pipeline when they finish high school, if they finish high school, and all the way a long traverse in life until they settle down and become a real adult, if they ever do, so to speak. Yes, quickly. Yeah. Real quick, yeah. Yeah.
But now it seems to be a more loose or a more transitional type of thing. Did you take that into account in your survey?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what's going on, is that it's not just that people got different ideas, it's that social institutions, everything from the global economic system to systems of higher education and graduate school, social institutions reinforce this and promote this and create conditions. They're not all saying, hey, let's create emerging adulthood, let's get a conspiracy. It's just that all of this together works to create this condition. And so, yeah, and part of it is the nature of what it takes to be a successful person now than in the past. The centrality of knowledge now, rather than in the mid-20th century. When I was a boy, what would have been taken to be a central, okay, my dad was an engineer, that required a certain kind of knowledge. But for most Americans, it required having a skill in manipulating the material world and being part of a labor union, and then you could be pretty successful. But that world is mostly over with. Those jobs have been outsourced. And so knowing how to navigate the digital blah, 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 it changes every year, is much more central. And so education is sort of trying to help people along the way. But yes. Okay. So switching to, so now I want to switch from what is emerging adulthood and where did it come from to what do most emerging adults, and here I'm generalizing, I'm putting them all together in one big bin and saying what do most of them assume about religion, faith, and spirituality and church and so on? What are the common outlooks that they share? So this is the middle row on the left. Well, unlike a lot of baby boomers who used to say, you never talk about religion and politics, for most emerging adults, they could talk about religion. It's not a threatening topic. It's just out there. If you want to talk about it, you can talk about it. However, they're mostly indifferent to the topic of religion. It's not something that's worth having a conflict or a fight about. It might be interesting. It might be something to gab about in the late wee hours of the morning, but for the most part, it's the general feeling is not hostility to religion. The general shared feeling is just indifference. It just doesn't matter that much. And it's partly because if you think about emerging adulthood, religion is associated with what one does when one is a real adult. Someday, emerging adults mostly say, I will be a real adult, and when I am, that's when I figure out the religion thing. But I'm not a real adult yet, and so I don't have to think about this. It's not, in fact, if I think about it too much, it'll get in the way of other things I want to focus on. And so the metaphor I use is to try to get many emerging adults to take seriously sort of religious faith and practice is equivalent to trying to get a 14-year-old to think really seriously about buying life insurance. You know, they know that there is such a thing. They know that someday maybe they'll have thought, I'll have to do that. But they would say, I'm only 14 years old. If I die, it's not relevant for me right now. Someday I'll think about it. And that's very similar to sort of how emerging adults would think about religion. Yeah, and maybe it's even important, but when I get older, I'll deal with it. So it's a life course script, not appropriate now, someday I'll get to it feel. You got that? It's really a crucial thing to get. It's not that there's hostility, it's that it's just indifferent, it's not relevant now. The shared central principles of religion are good. Again, the idea here is it's not that religion is evil or bad or horrible or to be despised. There's a minority, about 10% of emerging adults think that, but 90% think, yeah, religion's good, sure, helps people. I'm not against it. That would be the idea. But the shared central principles, what religions together agree upon, the general themes of religion are good. Religious particularities, however, are peripheral, meaning if any religion makes a particular claim, that doesn't really matter that much. So if all religions use the G word, God, okay, and then God's probably an all right thing to think about. If some religions use the J word, Jesus, that's like a peripheral thing. That's just what they happen to be into. And so if somebody wants to be into that, of course you can't judge them, but you don't have to take it seriously. So to the extent that the Catholics say, we are a particular church, we're not just some manifestation of general capital R generic religion, we make particular claims. We stand in particular places. We have a very particular Trinitarian understanding of God, for example. That feels like peripheral for many emerging adults. What is the point of religion? Why even be religious or have religion for emerging adults? Religion is for making good people. It's thought of as like a social institution whose function is to help people be good, to make good decisions, to be nice, to be more or less moral. That's the job of religion. Now, part of the problem there for religion is that emerging adults also know religious congregations, churches, do not have the monopoly on making people good. That is, you don't have to be religious to be good. So the thing that religion specializes in, it doesn't control, so to speak. You don't need it for that. You get that idea? Other non-religious people can be good too, and some religious people are bad. So it tends to be about something that's not necessary, in short. Okay, next slide. Religious congregations are elementary schools of morals. This is another way to put, now this is my phrasing, this is my rational reconstruction of the cultural model that emerging adults are working with. They would never put it this way, but I'm telling you what's going on back in the back of the assumptions of emerging adults, and that is, we would ask young people, why would you be part of a congregation? Why should anybody be involved in a church, say? And basically what they say is, well, that's where you go to learn your basic morals. You hear something in Sunday school, you learn not to steal or to lie. 10 Commandments sort of get imprinted in your brain. And that's good for people. I mean, pretty much everybody needs that, or a lot of people need it from church if they don't get it from elsewhere. So that's why church exists. And it's a good thing. You know, I'm glad, I'm talking like an emerging adult now, as they wouldn't put it exactly this way, but essentially, it's a good thing that there are lots of churches out there because it helps children to learn their basic morals. So the idea is, though, that this is not a college of morality. This is an elementary school of morality. The idea itself is morality is pretty simple. In fact, most people get it by common sense. It's not that complicated. And so it helps to have churches you take children to and they learn it. But then embedded in this idea implicitly but powerfully is, and then once you learn your elementary school level knowledge of morality, you're done. You graduate from elementary school, and then there isn't really a need for a middle school or a high school or college or seminary or graduate school. That is, to state it most bluntly, church is for children. And so, it's probably good I went to emerging adult would say, it's probably good I went to Sunday school. I learned how to not be stupid. I learned how to be nice. I learned how to make some good decisions, how to fit in with civilization, essentially, as I'm translating what they mean. And then, but when you're done, when you're done with 5th grade, you don't go back to 5th grade. You're done. When you're done, to switch metaphors, when you're done with driver's ed, you know how to drive. You don't keep going to driver's ed. Driver's ed is another great metaphor for this, like church, for lots of emerging adults, because many young people will say, okay, driver's ed is a pain, it's stupid, my teacher was terrible, we watched these ridiculous videos, but it's a good thing for society that we have driver's ed, because I want most people to be able to drive well. We should all learn the basic rules of driving, and so I'm willing to submit myself to going through it. I learned some valuable things. But when you're done with driver's ed, you don't keep going. You don't re-register for the fun of it. You're done. And that's a similar idea that emerging, again, they're not thinking too hard about it, but if you probe, what are the assumptions operating in the back of their minds about what is church good for? And so you go to church as a child, you get your basic morals, sometime as a teenager you're done, you spend your 20s doing other things, namely preparing for economic success and having fun. Those are the two imperatives of emerging adulthood. Prepare for economic success and have fun. And have as much fun as you can until it impinges upon your preparing for economic success. Unless you have rich parents, then you can mess yourself up a lot and they'll rescue you. Or if you don't have rich parents, you make one mistake and you've blown your life. All right, so a lot of this is social class oriented too. And then you're not in church for a long time, but you might go back to church eventually. If and when, why? Because of the elementary school of morals. You have children, and then it's your job. You're not going back to church for yourself, you're going back to church because your children need to go to the elementary school of morals. You got that? So you may in one's 30s and 40s go back to church for a while, but that's because your children need this. You following me? You got that idea? Okay. It's not a place of real belonging. We talk to emerging adults about who are your people? Where do you belong? Where do you feel at home? Some emerging adults will say, I have warm memories, I have fond memories of growing up in my church. Catholics will say this especially, I think. In my parish, it was a nice place. There's good people there. But I don't really belong there now. They're not my people now. So it's not a place of real belonging. Even though point number one is religion's not a very threatening topic, the next point is friends hardly talk about it. In general, it's just because it's not important. They're indifferent to it now. So there's not a lot to talk about other than, and especially in the early emerging adulthood, if one's been smoking pot for 3 hours, you might get in an interesting conversation about how does the Big Bang relate to, where did it come from if there wasn't a God? That might be, what do you think of evolution? But that's not a serious existential, where is my life going and who am I kind of conversation. You got that? Okay. Religious beliefs are cognitive assents, not life drivers. So a lot of emerging adults will say, yeah, I believe this. I believe in God. I believe in whatever. But it's just sort of like this check off that box. Yeah, I believe that. It's not something, that belief doesn't impinge upon how they're living. By the way, that's certainly not emerging adults either, and that's probably most of us. But if you ask emerging adults what is an authority, well, like what sticks? Who gets to say something that really is listened to? That's what I mean by authority. I don't mean authoritarian. I mean authority. Everyone has an authority. Like, I listen to that. That shapes me. When I throw it against the wall, it sticks. That's what I mean by authority. What is authority for emerging adults? What seems right to me? So it's a sort of individualistic, subjectivistic epistemology. I'm going through the world. Stuff comes at me. If it seems right to me, then I'll listen to it. There's no institution that's an authority. There's no tradition that's an authority. There's no certainly divinely mediated, divinely communicated revelation that's an authority. It's what seems right to me as the authority, functionally. You can take or leave what you want, therefore. Basically, most emerging adults, not all, but most have this sense of religions are traditions that are out there that have all these different things, accoutrements and pieces that they offer, and each of us as individuals can pick and choose what we want. I won't use the word cafeteria, but that's one of the definite images you can have in mind here. If you don't like macaroni and cheese, then don't get macaroni and cheese. It's up to you. Evidence and proof trumps blind faith. So ultimately, a very common language that emerging adults will use about religion is it's blind faith. Science has the truth, it has the facts, it has evidence. Religion is blind faith or opinion. Those are the cultural categories. Now this is funny because more broadly, emerging adults are pretty strong postmodernists. That is, modernity, reason, the West, Enlightenment, all of that is to be doubted. Except somehow, when it comes to science, they shift from third gear into reverse, and science has the truth. So they become moderns, they become modernists when it comes to science has the facts, science knows the reality. And most of them have bought into the religion versus science, rather than religion and science are compatible, and so therefore, science tells you the facts, and religion is just like a misunderstood Kierkegaardian existentialist leap into the dark if you want to do it, basically. If it's your opinion. And the best answer why many emerging adults can give as to why you would do that is, it's how I was raised. I'm comfortable with it. It's probably good enough for me. I'm not going to take it that seriously, but at least that's my story. Okay. Yeah.
Could you speak briefly about how you arrived at your sample?
Yeah, you're wondering, what is he talking about? We started off with a nationally representative sample of 13 to 17-year-olds in 2002 and 2003. That was done through a random digit dial survey, telephone survey. And so basically a computer, so this is kind of long, but basically it's a way to get a nationally representative sample of American households that have telephones or cell phones, which is almost all of them. And only about 1 or 2% don't have telephones or cell phones. And the way it's done is you don't use the white pages or some other list. We know what proportion of Americans live in which area codes and how many of them have which exchanges. I mean, we know that from census data. And so a computer generates the number of creates, let's say, 100,000 phone numbers randomly. We don't know if they're real. It just generates combinations of numbers in proportion to the distribution of what we know, how many people live in these area codes and these exchanges, the first 3 numbers of a telephone number. And then it generates randomly the last 4 digits. And then a computer just starts calling every one of these numbers. This is called random digit dial. Most of them turn out to be nothing, and you throw them out. Or they turn out to be Joe's Bar, and you throw it out. Or it turns out to be, remember payphones? Some of them turn out to be payphones, and you throw them out. And then basically you narrow down to which of these are real numbers, and which of these are households, and then you narrow down to which of these are households with 13 to 17-year-olds. So you start off with a couple 100,000 numbers and end up with 3,000 people you want to talk with. And that way you're not sampling on your Sunday school roll list or anything like, it's really, the only people who are excluded are people with no phones in their lives at all. That's the answer. And so then we subsampled our interviews, which is what this is based on, are a subsample of those who answered the telephone survey. After they did the survey, we called them back and said, thank you for doing the survey. We'd like to come to your hometown and talk to you for 2 hours in depth, and we'll pay you some money. And then we went around to 45 states and interviewed 300 and some of these kids in depth, representing all different religious traditions and so on. So we had 51, I think, Catholic kids from around the country. We also did this in 51 of 300 and whatever that we, no, of the interviews. See, there's a survey as the telephone. The interviews is in person. We had 3,200 and that of them, 25% of them would have been Catholic. Of the interviews in person, face to face, we did 365 or something, and then 51 of them would have been Catholic. Does that make sense? And the first wave of the survey was done in Spanish so that we weren't excluding Spanish-speaking households if there was a parent, et cetera. It was offered however they wanted it. So I promise you, we have the best, most nationally representative sample of young people that's been done. Yeah.
This is all very nice part. What I'm really interested in is how you got to be interested in merging religion with sociology.
I'm happy to talk to you about that, but that's not the focus of my talk. I want to talk to you about emerging adults, and then pretty soon get around to what might you have to say to these people? Speaking the gospel from the church, what possibly could be said that would connect? That's where we're trying to get to. But I'm trying to give you a sense of who these people are, whether they're sitting in the pews or much more likely not sitting in the pews, that what kind of preaching would be effective. But not that I wouldn't, okay, so moving right along here. Mainstream religion is fine, sure, why not? Religion is a personal thing, not a social or institutional thing. There are no institutions really in the end that matter to me. It's each person is an individual that they're deciding for themselves. If something is an institution, in American society broadly, it's actually to be suspect. Americans suspect the churches. They suspect business and military and government even more than the churches. We suspect all institutions. So religion is a personal thing. And finally, when it comes to religion, there's no way to know what's true. Nearly all, except for some evangelical and Mormon emerging adults or black young people emerging adults will say, you don't really know. There's no way to know what's true. There's no objective reference point that one can point to say, that tells me this is true. In the end, it's just individual subjective experience. Okay, so that's the general shared outlook of most, though not all, emerging adults. Any questions just about that piece? All right, the next thing is, yeah. There are lots of words that are used, there are a lot of phrases that have been used to describe emerging adulthood. One is extended adolescence. Because I like emerging adulthood because the idea is this is not just essentially being a teenager that you've been let to run on for too long. This is its own reality, it's its own experience, it's its own culture. Most teenagers are actually in a very different culture. They're much more institutionally located. They have things like high school and families that are sort of governing. This is like the end of teenager, the pipeline is open and it all just sort of gushes out in a million directions. Yeah. There are characteristics of this that feel to you and me like adolescent, but sociologically it's not just an extent. That's why Pardon me? Yeah, except it's not just a human developmental process. Again, it's institutionally embedded. The mass consumer capitalism likes to have lots of people with money that want what they want when they want it. The whole economic system is oriented around these people are great consumers. You know, they're not discerning or sort of self-limiting. Anyway. All right, so I've just talked about what most emerging adults share in common. Now what I want to do is break out and say, within this emerging adult thing, there are different kinds. And the point of this is, if you want to have a conversation from the point of view of the gospel or the church with an emerging adult, depending on the kind of emerging adult they are, will require very different conversations. So this is the bottom right-hand slide. We identified, this is not just Catholics, this is all emerging adults, and I'll tell you which tend to be more Catholic. There are 6 major religious types of emerging adults out there, and roughly these are the proportions. About 15% are committed traditionalists. These are people who were raised in a faith, they come from strong religious families, they know what they're supposed to believe, they've pretty much personally adopted it, they're practicing it, they can talk about their faith, they can talk about why things are moral in their lives, and so on and so on. These tend to be way disproportionately white evangelical, Mormon, and black Protestant. The second type are selective adherents. This is roughly almost a third of emerging adults were raised in a religious tradition, and they still identify with it, but they sort of selectively, I'll do this, but I won't do that. I kind of believe this, but I don't believe in that at all. So they are selective what they're going to do, what they're going to adhere to. And Catholics tend to be disproportionately in this group, so more than 30% of emerging adult Catholics would be selective adherents. These are the ones who will show up at Mass and will answer, yes, I'm a Catholic, on a survey, and think of themselves, but they're not really doing the full package, so to speak. They're picking and choosing what's comfortable for them. About 15% of emerging adults we identify as spiritually open. They're not spiritually seeking in that they're actively trying to figure something out. They're not going to Buddhist bookstores and trying to figure out the meaning of life. But they're spiritually open, like, could be, I'm interested, I'd be willing to talk with somebody. A lot of these come from non-religious backgrounds. A lot of non-religious young people who were never taught the Bible and anything religious feel like I've missed out on something. All my friends know stuff that I don't know, or they go to youth group, and why don't I have a youth group? So a lot of non-religious teenagers are not hardcore secularists. A lot of them feel a little left out of something, like something's going on among my friends that I've missed out on. And so by the time they become emerging adults, they're sort of like, I'm open to learning more about that. Again, they're still in the, when I get older, maybe I'll figure this out better. But right now, if you talk to them, they would have a conversation. Then there's the religiously indifferent. We think roughly a quarter of emerging adults are just indifferent. They're not against it. They just don't really care. It doesn't mean that much to them. And Catholics are disproportionately in this category of 4. So what the percentages listed here are American emerging adults. Catholics are going to be much more likely to fall into 2 or 4. Okay? Then there's a religiously disconnected. There's a small number of American young people out there that just don't know anything about religion. They've never been to religious service. Nobody in their family's religious. It's not that many non-religious kids have some exposure to religion. Amazingly, in this country, there are some emerging adults who are just, every answer to every religion question is, I don't know. They just don't know anything about religion. And then there's the irreligious, about 10%. These are the active, hostile, secular, make fun of religion, think it's completely implausible, listen to NPR too much, etc. And they are the ones who are hostile. But that's only 1 out of 10 is hostile. The rest are somewhere else. Now, if you run down this list and think, these are very different kind of characters of people, and if you were to sit down, if you were to say, you're going to go into the coffee shop and have an hour conversation with one of these people, and you want to have an effective conversation where you know the right questions to ask and the right kind of interesting things to talk with them and the right kind of posture to take on behalf of the Catholic Church with them, it'll matter which one of these types they are. You see what I'm saying? You will have very different things to say, or you should, depending on who you're sitting across from in the coffee shop. So the point is, even though I've spent a good bit of time saying most emerging adults are like this, the reality is, within that, there's all different subgroups, and they have very different questions, very different emotions, very different concerns about life and places in life. And so to get back to the question of this conference, to preach to them, so to speak, will require understanding where they are and where they're coming from and what message actually has any relevance to them. You see what I'm saying? I don't mean that in a consumerist way, like find out what their consumerist preference is and meet it. I mean it in an existential way. They're in a different place in life and they need a different conversation because that's where they are. Does that make sense? Okay. The last thing I want to do, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion, is to go back and create, and if you haven't already heard of this, to go back and describe the general religious faith that most emerging adults bring into emerging adulthood. Now this goes back to what I wrote about teenagers, 13 to 17-year-olds, and in the book Soul Searching, which has made its way around the green one, I basically concluded and argued that the true, functional, tacit, de facto religious faith of most American teenagers, and most Americans actually, it's the teenagers because it's also their parents, is not Methodism or Presbyterianism or Judaism or Islam or non-religion or Catholicism. It's something I call moralistic therapeutic deism. Have any of you heard of moralistic therapeutic deism? So this MTD is short, it's MTD, moralistic therapeutic deism. It's not moral, It's moralistic. See, I'm interested in morality and morals. That's like something one believes is right or wrong or good and bad, and there's a good reason for it. There's a story you could tell to explain why it's right or wrong. Moralistic is just this sort of, no, you shouldn't do that. Like we know, everybody knows, but it doesn't have this, it doesn't have an account for why it's right or wrong. It's just an assertion, and you should never do that or something. So here comes one last handout. Thank you. Moralistic therapeutic deism's creed, so to speak. Now, no teenager in America, well, now they are starting to, but when we did this survey, we didn't interview anyone that said, I'm a moralistic therapeutic deist. This is my rational reconstruction of what I think they actually believe. I took hundreds of teenagers telling me their view of religion, their beliefs, their living, and I sort of reconstructed what is the cultural model behind this? What do they assume? What's the core beliefs behind this that animate what they're telling me? The interesting thing about MTD is it's shared across all different religions. Jewish kids and Protestant kids and Catholic kids pretty much believe the same religion in MTD. What's different between them because of the particular religions is minor compared to what they share. And even non-religious kids are mostly moralistic therapeutic deists, unless they're hostile to religion per se, unless they're active secularists. Most non-religious American kids basically believe this too. So the creed is codified from what emerged from our interviews with teens, sounded something like this. A God exists who created and orders the world and watches over human life on earth. So it's theistic and believes in creation. 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and most world religions. So all religions teach the same thing. They all have the same, remember this goes back to the religion is for making good people, moral people. And the content of that morality is to be good, nice, and fair. The bar is not set too high. It's not die to oneself, say. And it's not love your neighbor just as you love yourself. It's just be nice. Whereas a lot of teens would put it in the negative, just don't be an asshole. That's what it takes. That's what God wants. Just don't be an asshole. So the bar is set pretty low. The central goal in life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. So what are we even doing here? What's the point of life? If there's any sense of what is the point of life, it's you should be happy and you should feel good about yourself. There's the therapeutic part, and God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when he's needed to involve a problem. Here is the qualified version of the deistic part. God is out there. God is away. God's not paying attention. He created things. He set things in motion. He said, everyone be nice to each other. But he's not really involved in, there's no like deep sacramental sense of God's involvement in the world, for example, here. When there's no evangelical sense of personal relationship all the time, God is looking over me. And there's none of either of those kind of senses. It's God is away. But if you get in a big problem, you can call on God and God will come to you. And so again, it links, the deism is there, but it's modified by the therapeutic, that God will help me to feel better or solve problems. It's not the Thomas Jefferson deism of God is really away and don't even try it. That God is away and you can call on God to make you feel better. And good people go to heaven when they die. So there's a heaven, whether there's a hell is another question, but there's a heaven, and who goes to heaven is if you're good. And almost everybody's good. As long as you're not a murderer or a bank robber, you're good. So there is a very little notion of sin. Sin is just wicked people, and there aren't that many of them. And everyone else is okay. They shouldn't be assholes, but at least most people aren't, and they'll go to heaven and be happy. You notice that the God is here. There's no Jesus Christ here. There's no Holy Spirit here. There's no Trinity here. There's no Eucharist here. There's no discipleship here. There's a bazillion things not here. Now, what my claim is simply this. This is what most teenagers actually believe in practice. And for emerging adults, this is what they come into emerging adulthood believing in practice. This is much clearer, more firmly crystallized among teenagers. By the time this starts to get, so we all say, well, that's really simplistic. How could that work? Life isn't possibly amenable to that. By the time people become emerging adults, increasingly this starts to fray at the edges because sometimes God doesn't come and solve their problems. And then, so this starts to weaken and break down among emerging adults. But it is still the dominant default religion. Let me put it this way. I guarantee you that the vast majority of Catholic young people actually believe that this is Catholicism. I can tell you that for an absolute fact. If you said to them, no, this is nice, but what about Catholicism? They would say, huh? They think this is Catholicism. They think this is Christianity. They don't think that there's anything wrong, there's any discrepancy. You know, of course, if the priest is doing something strange, that's fine, that's nice, that's a peripheral part of my tradition, but it's not central. This is central. So if you go back to, if you think images of God are central in anyone's life, the image of God here that I describe in the book is God is something like a divine butler and a cosmic therapist. It stays out of the way, is professionally impersonal. When the doorbell rings, we'll attend to it. When one is in pain, you can go to and it'll help you feel better. But otherwise, it minds their own business. That's God. You get that? You see how the moralistic? And the moralistic is, you should be nice to people. You shouldn't hurt people. You shouldn't sleep with somebody you don't have feelings for. I mean, there's all these sort of moralistic assertions that are linked up with this sort of God who's out there that created stuff and will take care of your problem. But really, it's all about, I want to feel good. Now, I'm not nailing teenagers with this. Our whole project has basically said, young people are great barometers of the larger society they're being raised in. They tell us about ourselves. Young people are great reflections of the adult world. Baby boomers grew up under this conceit that they were rebellious, that they were up against the wall, that they were rejecting the system, that they were opting out, that they were fundamentally different from the adult world than their adult world. And then they project that onto their children and say, my experience as a boomer has got to be my kids' experience. But young people's experience is very different. They're bought into the system. They want to succeed. They like technology. They like capitalism, essentially. They like material goods. They like the whole system. They just want to succeed in it and have fun with it. And so if we see something in a teenager, our response should not, or an emerging adult, our response should not be, well, what's wrong with young people these days? Our response is, well, I guess they tell us what we've taught them or what we've modeled. So it all sort of redounds back to all of us. So that's the end of what I'm going to have to say. The sort of the wrapping that up all together is not just to give you a depressing talk about the state of our culture, but to say the challenges are immense. The cultural underpinnings, for those of you that have an image of what American Catholicism was like in the 50s or the 40s or the 30s or maybe even the early 60s, the cultural underpinnings have so far shifted to different worlds that who are we preaching to requires something like a new evangelization, I guess. All right.